This is my favorite picture of the Veblen house. It was taken July 30th, 2007, which was an interesting date for two reasons. One, it was the 150th birthday of Thorstein Veblen, and the other event was it was the day that Ingmar Bergman died. So I decided to go out and ruminate on the nature of Scandinavian intellectualism, and which has very many things to think about if you want to know the truth. And all of a sudden it was golden hour, and I saw these beautiful pictures, and I ran around the house and shot it from all the angles. And what I want you to notice about this house is that it isn't terribly impressive. It's a nice house, but it's 24 by 36. It's, you know, it's a house. And I remember showing this to a guy from the Norwegian Historical Society, and he was not impressed at all. And you know, from the standards of, you know, is this some sort of piece of architectural genius? No, it's not. But it was built during the Civil War on the edge of the prairie by a guy who built it with the tools he could haul out onto the prairie with in one wagon. And it was all with hand, no power tools, and he had a lot of other things. He had a farm to start. He had, the first winter they actually lost one of their children. It was a very bitter winter. From the standpoint of the accomplishment of getting this house built, it was miraculous. It really was. It's just the house is in terrible shape. It's just terrible shape. For example, on the east side of the house, snow had blown in through the door and through broken windows, and so from the wall of the back to where the rot stopped on the floor was about 7 feet. And there was a lot of how do we fix this? And because one of the things that had happened was when they built it in the first place, they were cutting up trees, and so these boards tended to taper, and Papa Veblen, he'd take one and then he'd turn the other one around, and so fitting this in was a lot of trouble. And instead of tongue and groove, it was groove and spline. So you took the solid wood, you cut a groove in there, and you put a spline, so it went together. All that had to be fit back together. It's one of the reasons this restoration cost about $1 million, which gets us to the first really interesting story here. The guy that paid for all of this was a guy named Bill Melton. And Bill Melton was, at the time, was he the senior chief economist at IDS American Express? He had a lot of money, and if you spend it on restoration, you get a lot of tax shelter. So I don't think it cost him $1 million, but that's how much it cost. And I was very fortunate because it was his money. He could basically do what he wanted. And he brought in a builder named Peter McKinnon, and Peter McKinnon was just the perfect choice because Peter was, I don't know if you knew anybody when you were growing up that built model airplanes and wanted to make sure there were rivets wherever, on the model that were on the real airplane and scaled down to the right size. That's Peter. He wanted to make this house as authentic as possible. He wanted, if it was groove and spline floor, he did groove and spline floor. And one of the things, for example, was that the snow over the years had drifted up on there was a foundation, and on the top where we put rim joists, they put a 12 by 12 white oak beam all the way around. And then Papa Veblen, to save money on nails, which was really hard, they were really hard to get during the Civil War, save money on nails, he made mortises, and so all those studs were mortised in. Well, these 12 by 12s had gotten really rotten. So what happened? They had to lift the whole house up, get new white 12 by 12 beams, which is a lot harder to do now than it was then, mortise them, drop it back down. Now we're starting to understand why this place got it's $1 million to do a 24 by 36 house. I was really impressed by the effort. And Melton made one other really, really critically important decision, and that was, it was his opinion, and his opinion was justified by a lot of facts, that this house, no matter how well you fixed it up, if it wasn't occupied, it was going to all fall apart again. So the restoration had to be not only, you know, visually authentic and the rooms in the right place and the plaster the right thickness and all the rest of it. They did all of that, but they also snuck in air conditioning, you know, running water, a modern bathroom, heating ducts, putting heating ducts up through these walls. They basically had to disassemble the walls and put these custom-made heating ducts up there. But it's been occupied ever since. So, and the people who currently occupy it are really, really good matches for this project. You know, Fjellstedt in some ways is kind of like a Norwegian pioneer. So, visually authentic, you know, designed so that all the, you know, the problems that destroyed the house in the first place were fixed. This is the last story on the fixing the house. The water ran into that basement basically from the day it was built. And you're going to have people living in this, they aren't going to put up with that. Let's get this thing done. Well, in order to make a hand-laid limestone foundation waterproof, they dug all the way around, wide enough away from the foundation so that they could, somebody could go in there, and they basically tuck pointed it from the outside, sprayed it with some spraycrete that covered it, waterproofed it, put a tile system that had perforations that and hooked up to a tile thing that went way out in the field, at least 1,000 feet. So when Ed and I were out there, I said, "Is the basement dry?" He says, "Well, we have to put a dehumidifier in there in the summer." I'm thinking, I think in the first 100 years of this house, it was wet like it's in standing water every time it rained. And you know, so a dehumidifier is a vast improvement. But again, all that fooling around costs money. And at that point, Melton was making nice with the Minnesota Historical Society, and they suggested that when they dug out this dirt around the foundation, that they sifted all in case there were some artifacts that were going to be found. Well, I know we all wagged our head and go, "Good Lord, what are you guys up to? You know, what are you going to find? Bottle caps?" And the truth is, they found nothing because they had dug the hole just the right size and basically lined the pit with these rocks. And so I think they were digging in undisturbed dirt. So, but you know, it got done. It was gorgeous. The family was just thrilled. I helped organize the party for the family. Most of them have, you know, moved to the West Coast or whatever. I think there's a couple of Veblen offspring that are still in Minnesota, but generally speaking, they went on to bigger and better things. This was a very accomplished family. I mean, the oldest son was a mathematician and physics professor at Iowa State his whole career. And, these were people of immense capability. And of course, then we had this world-class genius. And, but of course, it wasn't the house that was being saved, and certainly not for architectural reasons. It was being saved because of who lived there. And boy, that's a complicated subject, because Veblen himself has, well, here's a good example of the reputation that the man had. In 1916, he published a book called Imperial Germany and the Industrial Revolution. Brilliant book, just a brilliant book. And it's sort of this monument to an intellectual practice that Veblen perfected, called institutional analysis. And as you read it, it was like, why did Germany develop industrially so much faster than England, even though they were second? And of course, that's the reason, it's because they were second. And somebody decided that this was a pro-German manifesto, and they opened an FBI dossier on this, on Veblen. I was at a convention a few years back, and the guys had finally, done the Freedom of Information Act. They got the FBI reports on Thorstein Veblen, and basically these reports were just hopelessly confused. They didn't know what he was saying. They'd go to his lectures, and they'd come away just, and that's part of, the Veblen problem. Veblen was extremely interesting and extremely bright, but he tended to have readers like Albert Einstein, who at one point wrote that Veblen was his favorite social scientist. And so, it's a trick to read these things. You read the Theory of the Leisure class. Was the language an obstacle for you?
Oh, it's different.
Yeah, no kidding. Anyway, so in a sense, for me, it's why does this guy's ideas, why do they still have conventions where they talk about him? And why do they, it's very interesting that, well, for instance, the Theory of the Leisure class was first published in 1899 and has not been out of print since. Now almost all of them are in the public domain. The 100 Years, his last book was published in 1921, so that will be the end of anything. And there's websites there that you can download almost all of his books. And quite a few of his papers. He wrote 10 books and 100 papers. He was quite prolific. And of course, some of them aren't so interesting, but some of them are fascinating. For instance, Veblen wrote a book review on John Maynard Keynes' famous book that he wrote called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which criticized the Versailles Treaty. Now, lots of people think that Keynes was overly harsh on the British establishment that wrote the Versailles Treaty, mostly. Veblen didn't think that at all. He thought Keynes was just, brushing it over, that Keynes was an interesting guy, but about as interesting as you could be and be an investment banker in England on the board of Cambridge. And, sort of the Paul Krugman. He's as enlightened as you can be and still write for the New York Times. I'll tell you my personal feeling. Of all the things in all the books, the one that just grabbed me was his theory between business and his distinction he drew between business and industry. business, industry was the part of society that organizes the tasks of survival. They build the buildings, they grow the food, they ship the food, they get the coal out of the ground. They do this is industry. Business is the group that, as he puts it, through force and fraud, fastens itself on the back of the productive classes for the oftentimes purpose of getting something for nothing. So that's what he calls business, and industry is, the rest of it. For me, this was one of those observations that cannot be unseen. You cannot ignore it once you've figured this out. I'm kind of obsessed over it over the years, because the more you think about it, the more you see the difference between a hedge fund and Elon Musk and Tesla. And what's so interesting is that the general public understands this intrinsically. For example, when John D. Rockefeller died, 8 people showed up at his funeral, and 7 of them hoped to be in his will. Okay? John D. Rockefeller was not a popular guy. On the other hand, when Henry Ford died, 30,000 people stood in the rain for hours so that he could walk by his casket. Okay? Or, for example, when Steve Jobs died, there were people that made spontaneous shrines around the world. They had piles of flowers, and people with their iPhones, with a candle flickering, and it was all very clever, and it was all spontaneous, and it was an act of love, and it's because he was industry and not business. He was popular because he showed folks how to make computers cool. For folks like artists who would never be able to use a computer without this help. And so the general public understands the difference between business and industry, but it never gets talked about. A Marxist will literally try to kill you if you try to say that there's a difference between business and industry. No. All rich people are, it's the bourgeoisie. And the people on the bottom are the proletariat. No, what are you talking about? There's a difference between business and industry. So, a few years back, it's getting to be almost 30 now. My book was going to be published in Finland, in translation, in Finnish. And I get this thing from one of the editors. You're talking about the leisure class. Would you like to talk about the leisure class? In terms, and all of a sudden it was, is this really just Marx Jr.? Which is kind of how the Europeans approach Veblen. They just look at him as he came after Marx, and he isn't quite as violent, and he did, and the rest of this, and he's just not the full-fledged stuff, in this leisure class. What the hell is that? And so I've been trying to make graphic representations of the difference between Veblen's class structure. And that's my next picture. Understand that you have rich and poor members of the leisure class, and you have rich and poor members of the producing classes. For instance, a poor member of the producing class would be like a migrant worker picking strawberries. That's it's poor, it's difficult, it's hideous. Producing class. A rich one would be Elon Musk. They all have very, very different interests than the leisure class, who are trying to get as much wealth out of this group as they can. That's their job. So that's why I like Veblen, is because when he got me going on that distinction between business and industry, I never let go. And that leads me to my last handout. For the purpose of pleasing the editors in Finland, I did this to show that there are fundamental anthropological differences between predators and producers. How they approach business, how they approach education, how they approach history, all sorts of differences. And so, producers and predators, leisure class and industrial class. There's one further thing, as someone who is seriously a Viking, I mean, all my relatives. I have one Norwegian and 7 Swedish ancestors, and they're all Vikings, all of them. I'm also a son of a Lutheran minister, so I have this kind of, you know, who turned Vikings into Scandinavians? It was Christianity, but more important, it was the Lutheran Church. You know, deal with it, son. You know, after I read Veblen, I said, you know what really is the story here? In order for the Viking society to succeed, you had to have the guys that wanted to go out on the North Sea and raid Ireland or whatever. But you had to have somebody that stayed at home and made those boats. And over time, the guys that went out to sea wound up not coming home. And you know, the guys that knew how to build boats also knew how to put up shelves and, you know, in Ma's closet. And they wound up so you have this society that went from the most feared in Europe, deliver us, O Lord, from the Northmen, you know. It was a prayer, common prayer in most of Europe, to this society of just world-class builders. It doesn't matter what they're building, they're just good at it. And it has to do, in my mind, with the fact that the boat builders, you know, stayed home to build the next boat. And, you know, and Sven went out with his axe and sometimes didn't come home. And, you know, Sven left a widow behind, and, you know, the guy that knew how to build things, you know, I might have not have gotten the first shot at this woman, but he got the second shot. And you do this for 500 years, and pretty soon you have a very peaceable society of super builders. And I mean, it's steel, it's, you know, what don't the Scandinavians build? They build locomotives and cars and buses and drugs and computers and cell phone towers and whatever. They're just good at building things. My favorite story on that is in Denmark in the 70s, a folk school decided to build a windmill. And it was 2 megawatts. It was a big windmill. And it was built by volunteers. Now, the reason this is such an interesting story is that at the same time, Boeing was trying to build a windmill of roughly the same size and gave up. I mean, we're talking about serious, I mean, they just decided to build it and built it. And complete with all the money that Boeing got from NASA. I think NASA was funding this big windmill. They gave up. And this one is still turning. You can go Google it and you can see it from space. It's a big windmill. And of course Denmark is just, it's one of their major export industries is windmills. So, you know, this is a culture that got good at this sort of stuff, and they've stayed good at it. And they came over here too. I mean, I got a lot of relatives that were in the aerospace industry, and you know, I think Kelly Johnson is a pretty good example of how good the Swedes were at building airplanes. I mean, the list of his airplanes is just amazing, and including the SR-71, the U-2, the P-38, the F-104. If it's an airplane that impresses you, Kelly Johnson might have had a hand in it. That's how good he was. And so I look on kind of aerospace as, you know, kind of a family business, because I have so many relatives that work for Boeing in Wichita and places like that. So, you know, our tribe succeed. Well, look at here in the Twin Cities. There's a lot of small, medium-sized businesses that make very difficult things. They're all over Eden Prairie. I know that for a fact. And it's our contribution to human progress. We build things, and we build them well. And so we're interested in the philosophies of the producing classes, because, and that's, my book in Finland was published by a publishing house owned by a trade union of engineers. So that's where that comes from. So that's my thing. If read Veblen, he probably wouldn't have approved of the money that got spent on fixing up that house, but I'm sure he would be very appreciative if you went out and read some of his books. And Theory of the Leisure Classes, of course, is everybody's favorite, but there's some other ones that are just magnificent. Instinct of Workmanship is magnificent. So that's my interest in Veblen.
Thank you very much.